"I thought she was getting old," said the Apache widow, until she shared a bed with a cowboy. Its wooden walls were worn and weathered, and the paint, once bright, had long since faded into soft shades of cream and brown. Despite the signs of age, the house had a quiet charm of its own, much like the widow herself. She had lived alone for many years, tending to her home with a careful, steady hand. Every corner told a story of her life. The small fireplace where she warmed herself on chilly nights, the well-worn rocking chair by the window where she often sat to watch the world outside, and the little garden out back where wild flowers and herbs grew in abundance. Her days followed a simple rhythm. She rose with the sun, when the first light painted the horizon in gentle shades of orange and pink. She would make a small breakfast, usually eggs, bread, and a bit of fresh milk, then step outside to water the garden or check the small stack of firewood she kept neatly piled by the door. Life had taught her patience, and she moved with calm deliberation, never rushing, never seeking more than what was necessary. It was a quiet, orderly life, the kind that allowed one to reflect, to remember, and to simply be. Though the widow was known to the townspeople, she was not a woman who mingled much. Her manners were polite, her words few but thoughtful, and her gaze steady and discerning. People often described her as strong-willed, even stubborn at times, but there was a gentleness beneath that firmness. Children would sometimes peek through her fence to see her tending her flowers, and she would offer them a small smile or a nod. Young mothers passing by would glance at her in passing, wondering what her life had been like, what stories she could tell. Yet few ventured close enough to truly know her. Time had left its mark on her. There were lines on her face, subtle but telling, that spoke of years of both joy and sorrow. Her hair had silvered over time, framing a face that was still striking, even if the world no longer paused to notice it. She often remarked, almost to herself, that she felt her best days were behind her, that perhaps the excitement and adventure of youth had passed her by. And yet, there was a quiet pride in her stance, a dignity in the way she carried herself. She knew the value of her own presence, even if the world had moved on. The widow's evenings were often spent in reflection. She would sit by the window, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in rich hues of red and gold. Sometimes she would think of her late husband, remembering the life they had shared, the laughter, the struggles, and the silent moments of understanding between them. Those memories brought a mixture of warmth and melancholy. She missed the companionship, the shared responsibilities, and the simple comfort of another soul in the home. Yet, she had learned to live with the quiet, to fill her life with the routines and small pleasures that sustained her. Despite her solitary life, she remained keenly aware of the town and its people. She knew who had married, who had children, who had moved away, and who had passed on. The widow often shopped in the small general store, exchanging a few words with the shopkeeper or nodding to neighbors. But her interactions were brief, never lingering. She had grown accustomed to watching life unfold around her rather than actively participating in it. There was safety in her routine, a predictability that she cherished. The townspeople, in turn, respected her space. They admired her independence and quietly accepted that she chose to live her life on her own terms. The Apache widow's home was filled with signs of her heritage and her past. Small trinkets, handmade by her ancestors, adorned shelves and walls. Patterns woven into blankets and tablecloths told stories of generations before her. She took pride in maintaining these treasures, seeing them as a bridge between the past and the present. Each item carried meaning, a reminder of resilience, tradition, and identity. Visitors who were lucky enough to enter her home often commented on the sense of history and warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. Though she lived a life of quiet routine, the widow was not without curiosity. She enjoyed reading, often borrowing books from the town's small library. Stories of distant lands, adventure, and human courage fascinated her. They offered a window into experiences she had not lived, and she would imagine herself in those tales, traveling across deserts, climbing mountains, or riding across wide open plains. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees, she felt a longing for movement, a desire to feel the world beyond her garden and house. But she would quickly remind herself that her life, as it was, had its own beauty. The seasons marked the passage of time more clearly than any clock. In the spring, the garden would bloom with vibrant colors, and the widow would spend hours tending to each plant with careful attention. Summer brought the warmth of long days, where the sun's rays bathed her home and fields in golden light. Autumn painted the landscape with rich oranges and reds, and she would collect fallen leaves, enjoying the simple beauty of nature's cycle. Winter, though harsh, held a quiet peace. The fireplace would crackle warmly, and the snow-covered landscape outside made her small house feel like a sanctuary. Neighbors occasionally tried to draw her out of her solitude. They would invite her to community gatherings, to help with local festivals, or simply to share a meal. She would often decline, politely but firmly, saying that she preferred the comfort of her home. Some assumed she was growing old, that perhaps her body or spirit could no longer keep pace with social life. But in truth, she simply valued the control she had over her own existence. She knew what brought her peace and happiness, and she had learned to protect it carefully. Yet despite her careful control, the widow was not blind to change. She noticed new faces in town, the arrival of travelers, and the small shifts in the daily routines of those around her. Sometimes she would feel a subtle stirring inside her, a tiny spark of interest, curiosity, or even longing. She would brush it aside, telling herself that life had settled into its natural course, and that surprises were best left to others. She had her garden, her books, her memories, and her quiet home. That, she believed, was enough. In these quiet moments, she would often speak to herself, softly and almost without thought. She would say, "I suppose these are my best years now," or "Life has slowed, and perhaps that is how it should be." There was no bitterness in her words, only a gentle acknowledgement of reality. She accepted that some adventures had passed, but she remained open, in her own way, to the small joys and discoveries that each day could bring. She understood the value of resilience, patience, and self-sufficiency. And so, the Apache widow continued her days, moving with grace and quiet strength through a life that was hers alone. She was respected, admired, and, in her own way, content. Her home, her garden, and her routines offered a sense of purpose and continuity. Yet beneath the calm surface, there lingered a faint, almost imperceptible sense of anticipation. It was subtle, a twitch of curiosity at a new sound, a flicker of interest in a passing stranger, a thought that perhaps, just perhaps, life still had surprises to offer. It was a life that seemed complete, settled, and predictable. But as she looked out over the horizon each evening, watching the sun sink behind distant hills, there was a quiet question in her heart. Could there still be more to life than she had imagined? Could the years ahead hold moments of laughter, companionship, or excitement she had thought were long gone? She didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in a long while, she wondered, and that wondering itself was a small spark of life stirring in her soul. The widow closed her eyes at night, the gentle creak of her rocking chair fading as she settled into bed. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of the night, the wind whispering through the trees, the distant call of an owl, and the faint rustle of her curtains. She felt a sense of peace, but also a faint, restless energy, a reminder that life, even in its quietest form, was never truly stagnant. Tomorrow would bring another day, another sunrise, and perhaps, just perhaps, something unexpected. And so life went on, slow and steady, filled with routine yet alive with small, hidden possibilities. The Apache widow remained a figure of quiet strength, dignity, and subtle curiosity, waiting for the world to reveal what it had in store, even if she did not yet know that the first surprise was closer than she imagined. The quiet rhythm of the Apache widow's life was interrupted. One late afternoon, by the sound of hooves clattering along the dusty street. She had just finished watering her garden and was wiping her hands on her apron when she noticed a rider approaching. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn leather from head to toe. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but she could see a flash of sun-kissed skin and sharp, observant eyes beneath it. He rode with a confident ease, the kind that suggested he had traveled many miles and seen much of the world. The townspeople paused to watch him as he entered. Travelers were not uncommon in the town, but there was something different about this man. He carried an air of freedom, a kind of quiet danger, and yet a subtle charm that made people instinctively trust him. The widow observed from a distance, her curiosity piqued. Normally, she would have looked away, returned to her home, and resumed her routine. But something about this cowboy made her linger, even as she tried to dismiss the thought. He dismounted near the general store, swinging his leg over the saddle with practiced skill. His boots were dusty, his clothes a little frayed, yet he carried himself with pride. He spoke briefly with the shopkeeper, his voice low but firm, and then looked around the town, taking it all in with calm interest. The widow noticed that his gaze lingered for a moment on her garden, on the neat little rows of herbs and flowers she had tended for years. There was a faint smile on his lips, as though he appreciated the quiet beauty of her home. For a few days, the cowboy became a regular presence in the town. He would come to the store for supplies, exchange brief words with locals, and occasionally sit outside the saloon to rest from his travels. The widow watched him, maintaining her distance but secretly noting his routines. He seemed independent, self-sufficient, yet approachable. There was a balance to him that was rare, a mix of strength and gentleness. She found herself wondering about the life he had led, the places he had seen, and the stories he could tell. Their first direct interaction was accidental. One morning, as the widow carried a basket of freshly picked herbs toward her kitchen, the cowboy appeared on the path in front of her. He tipped his hat politely, and she responded with a small nod. Neither spoke at first, each sizing the other up. Then he said something simple, almost casual about the weather, and she replied with a remark about the garden. The conversation was brief, but it carried a weight neither could ignore. There was a spark of recognition, an unspoken understanding that their meeting was more than mere coincidence. Over the next several days, circumstances forced them into closer contact. Perhaps it was a sudden summer storm that drove them both under the small awning of the general store, or a shared errand that led them to travel together along the dusty road. The widow felt a flutter of unease mixed with excitement. She had grown accustomed to her routine, to the quiet predictability of her life, and yet here was someone who challenged that stability, not with force, but with presence. The cowboy spoke with warmth and humor, sharing small stories of the road and asking her gentle questions about her life. For the first time in years, she found herself laughing openly, the sound surprising even her. The cowboy seemed equally intrigued by her. He asked about her garden, the books she read, and the traditions she followed. He listened attentively, never interrupting, never judging. She realized that she was not just talking to pass the time, she was sharing a part of herself, a part she had long kept hidden. His interest felt genuine, and it was something she had not experienced in many years. The careful, solitary life she had built around herself was suddenly infused with a new energy, a possibility she had thought long gone. Their friendship grew naturally. The widow found reasons to step outside more often, to walk into town, or to visit the small stream just beyond her property. The cowboy would often be there, tending his horse, repairing a fence, or simply enjoying the view. They would speak quietly, exchanging stories about distant places, about people they had met, and about lessons learned from life. In these moments, the widow felt a sense of connection she had not known she was missing. She began to realize that even in her later years, life still had the power to surprise and to delight. The town began to notice the change in her. Neighbors who had once seen her only as a quiet, solitary figure started observing the subtle transformations. There was a lightness in her step, a sparkle in her eyes, and a warmth in her smile that had not been there before. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the cowboy had become a friend, or perhaps something more. She ignored the gossip, though she could not deny the sense of anticipation that grew within her whenever he appeared. The widow, for all her independence, began to feel a renewed curiosity about the world. She asked the cowboy questions about the towns he had visited, the people he had met, and the adventures he had experienced. He spoke with vivid detail, painting pictures of wide deserts, tall mountains, and bustling cities far beyond their small town. She listened intently, imagining herself walking those roads, feeling the wind on her face, and living a life that she had only read about in books. Each story brought a sense of excitement, a hint that the quiet years of her life were not the end, but merely a pause before something new. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, the widow found herself sitting on her porch with the cowboy. He had stopped by to deliver a small package of supplies, but the conversation lingered. They spoke of simple things, flowers, birds, the taste of fresh bread, but also of deeper matters, regrets, hopes, and the subtle lessons that life had taught them. She realized that in his presence she felt heard and understood, something she had not felt in many years. It was a rare and comforting sensation, and it left her quietly hopeful. The cowboy never pressed her or made her feel uncomfortable. He respected her boundaries and moved at a pace she could accept. Yet he had a way of gently challenging her, encouraging her to step beyond the confines of her routine. He suggested walks along the creek, trips to the edge of town, and small adventures that required courage and spontaneity. She found herself agreeing almost instinctively and discovering joys she had long forgotten. Each small adventure, each shared story, strengthened the bond between them, even if neither wanted to name it aloud. Despite her excitement, the widow remained cautious. Years of solitude had taught her to protect herself, to value independence, and to guard her heart. She would sometimes pause, reminding herself that this was new, unexpected, and perhaps temporary. Yet each time she saw the cowboy's easy smile or heard his gentle laugh, her reservations softened. She began to understand that the passage of time did not diminish the capacity for connection, for companionship, or for joy. Even in the later stages of life, there were moments that could awaken the spirit. The cowboy, too, seemed changed by their interactions. He had traveled far, seen much, and yet there was a freshness in his demeanor when he was with her. He laughed more freely, listened more intently, and seemed to appreciate the quiet rhythm of her world. Their exchanges were simple, honest, and filled with a warmth that neither had anticipated. What began as a casual acquaintance blossomed into something deeper, a shared understanding that life could still hold surprises, and that connection could appear where least expected. As days turned into weeks, the widow found herself anticipating the cowboy's visits. She looked forward to the sound of hooves on the road, the sight of his broad hat tipping politely, and the ease with which he entered her space. Her home, once a quiet sanctuary, became a place of warmth, laughter, and lively conversation. She realized that she had been living in a kind of half-sleep, content but unaware of the richness that life could still offer. With his presence, the world seemed brighter, fuller, and more alive. One morning, a sudden summer rainstorm forced the widow and the cowboy to take shelter under the wide porch of her house. They huddled together, sharing stories and laughter as the rain poured around them. The moment was intimate but innocent, filled with a quiet thrill of closeness. She noticed how natural it felt to be in his presence, how easy it was to share thoughts and feelings without fear or hesitation. That day marked a turning point. She realized that her life, which she had thought was slow and predictable, could still be touched by spontaneity, friendship, and perhaps even something more. By the end of part 2, the Apache widow's world had begun to shift. She was no longer just a quiet observer of life. She had become a participant once more. The cowboy had awakened a curiosity, a sense of possibility, and a joy she had thought long gone. She understood that life could still offer surprises, that companionship could arrive unexpectedly, and that the heart was capable of renewal at any age. And while she did not yet know where this new path would lead, she felt a quiet excitement, a readiness for whatever might come next. Days turned into weeks, and the connection between the Apache widow and the cowboy grew stronger. What had begun as curiosity and casual conversation developed into a bond that neither of them had expected. Each encounter was filled with warmth, humor, and a sense of companionship that had been missing from her life for many years. The widow found herself eagerly anticipating his visits, and even small moments, like the sound of his voice, the flash of a smile, or the gentle tip of his hat, brought a sense of happiness she had long forgotten. Their conversations became longer and more personal. The widow shared stories of her past, her late husband, and the life she had built for herself in solitude. She spoke of joys and regrets, of quiet triumphs and small losses, trusting that the cowboy would understand. He listened with care, never interrupting, never judging, and often sharing his own experiences. His life had been full of adventure, travel, and challenges, but he spoke with a simplicity and honesty that made the widow feel at ease. It was the kind of conversation that felt natural, comfortable, and deeply human. As the widow shared more of herself, she began to notice subtle changes in her own demeanor. Her eyes held a sparkle that had long been absent, her steps became lighter, and there was a newfound confidence in her movements. The townspeople, who had grown accustomed to seeing her as a quiet, solitary figure, started to notice these changes. They whispered among themselves, amazed at the transformation in a woman they had considered reserved and distant. Children noticed her laughter, which had become more frequent, and neighbors found themselves greeted with warmth rather than distant politeness. The cowboy, too, seemed to feel a shift. He had been a traveler, passing through towns and roads for years, but he found himself lingering here, drawn to the widow's presence. Her quiet strength, wisdom, and gentle humor captivated him in a way that few people had. He admired her independence, yet he also recognized the kindness and vulnerability she carried beneath her composed exterior. In her presence, he could relax, share his thoughts, and feel understood without pretense or judgment. Their bond grew steadily, built on mutual respect, trust, and a shared sense of humanity. They spent time together in small, simple ways that gradually became meaningful. Walks along the riverbank, tending to the garden, or sitting on the porch to watch the sunset became cherished rituals. Each activity, though ordinary, was filled with conversation, laughter, and the quiet enjoyment of each other's company. The widow found herself looking forward to these moments, with an anticipation she had not felt in years. She realized that life could still offer small joys, surprises, and connections that brought depth and warmth to her days. The cowboy encouraged her to explore beyond the confines of her home and garden. He suggested short trips into the surrounding countryside, where they could observe the beauty of nature together, the wildflowers, the birds, and the sweeping views of distant hills. At first, the widow was hesitant. She had grown accustomed to the safety and comfort of her home, and the thought of venturing further seemed unnecessary. But the cowboy's gentle encouragement, combined with his presence, made the idea feel exciting rather than intimidating. These excursions brought a sense of adventure to her life, reminding her that the world was larger than the small town she had known for so long. One afternoon, they took a walk along a narrow trail that led to a hidden grove. The sun filtered through the trees, casting playful patterns on the ground, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. The widow felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced in years. She spoke openly with the cowboy about her dreams, her fears, and the life she had imagined in her younger years. He listened with patience and understanding, offering insights and sharing his own reflections. In that quiet, sunlit grove, she felt a connection that transcended words, a sense that they were kindred spirits, each finding in the other a companion who could understand the depths of their experience. Their friendship was not without moments of introspection. The widow often wondered how a man like the cowboy could be so interested in someone like her. She questioned whether she deserved such attention, whether it was appropriate, or whether it might disrupt the life she had carefully built for herself. Yet each time she saw his kind eyes or heard his easy laughter, those doubts faded. She realized that the heart was capable of surprising itself, of discovering feelings and connections that defied logic or expectation. The cowboy, for his part, was equally thoughtful. He had traveled extensively, met many people, and experienced both hardship and joy, but he found something unique in the widow's presence. Her wisdom, strength, and gentleness touched him in ways he had not anticipated. He admired her resilience, the way she had maintained her life despite loss and solitude, and he was inspired by her capacity for warmth and understanding. Each shared moment deepened his respect and affection for her, making him feel a sense of home that he had long sought but never found. As their bond grew, small gestures became significant. The widow would leave a freshly baked loaf of bread on the porch for the cowboy, and he would offer herbs or small gifts he found along his travels. They laughed at shared jokes, exchanged meaningful glances, and occasionally lingered in silence, appreciating the simple presence of one another. These ordinary acts became symbols of trust and affection, building a connection that was quiet yet profound. The widow began to understand that intimacy was not only physical, it could be emotional, spiritual, and intellectual, a sharing of hearts and minds that brought comfort and joy. One evening, after a long day of tending the garden together, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers. The widow felt a surge of gratitude and wonder. Here she was, in her later years, experiencing a connection that was full of laughter, companionship, and shared understanding. It was a gift she had not expected, a reminder that life could still surprise, even when it seemed that the best days were behind her. The townspeople noticed the transformation more clearly now. The widow, once reserved and solitary, now radiated warmth and energy. Neighbors saw her walking with a spring in her step, chatting easily with others, and smiling in ways they had rarely witnessed. Children approached her without fear, drawn to the joy and openness she now carried. Even those who had once assumed she was growing old and past her prime began to see her in a new light, a woman full of life, wisdom, and a renewed sense of possibility. The widow herself was learning to embrace the changes within her. She realized that age was not a barrier to connection, adventure, or joy. She could still feel excitement, curiosity, and even desire. She could still experience moments of surprise, laughter, and closeness. The cowboy had awakened a part of her spirit that she had long thought dormant, showing her that life's richness was not determined by years, but by openness, courage, and the willingness to embrace what came her way. Their relationship continued to grow naturally, free from pressure or expectation. The cowboy respected her boundaries, never rushing, never insisting, yet always present in ways that mattered. The widow, in turn, allowed herself to be vulnerable, to share her thoughts and feelings, and to accept the comfort and companionship he offered. Together, they discovered a rhythm that felt both exciting and grounding, a balance of adventure and stability, of laughter and quiet reflection. Even in solitude, the widow no longer felt alone. She had discovered that human connection, trust, and affection could arrive unexpectedly, and that these gifts were not limited to youth or circumstance. The cowboy had opened her eyes to the joy of companionship, the thrill of small adventures, and the beauty of shared understanding. She was learning to live again, not just to exist, but to embrace life fully, to notice the world around her, and to treasure each moment with gratitude and openness. By the end of Part 3, the Apache widow had begun to truly rediscover herself. She laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and moved through the world with a renewed sense of confidence and curiosity. The cowboy had become not only a companion but a mirror, reflecting the strength, wisdom, and vitality she had long carried within her. Their friendship had deepened into something meaningful, touching both of their lives in profound and unexpected ways. And though they did not yet know what the future held, the widow felt a quiet assurance that life's possibilities were far from over. The summer air had grown heavy and warm, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-baked earth across the quiet town. The Apache widow had grown accustomed to the cowboy's presence in her life, yet each day still held a thrill she could not explain. Their friendship had deepened, moving beyond shared laughter and gentle conversation to something more profound, a quiet understanding that each was no longer merely passing through the other's life, but leaving an impression that could not easily be erased. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm swept through the town. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in swiftly, and a sharp wind carried the scent of rain. The widow was closing the windows of her small house when she noticed the cowboy approaching along the dirt road. His coat was damp, and his hat sat low over his eyes, but his presence brought a calm reassurance. He had not intended to be caught in the storm, yet here he was, as if guided by instinct to her home. Without hesitation, the widow invited him inside. He nodded gratefully, shaking the rain from his coat before stepping through the doorway. The house was warm, the scent of fresh herbs and wildflowers mingling with the earthy aroma of rain. She offered him a towel and a cup of tea, and they both paused to listen to the storm as it drummed against the roof and rattled the windows. The sound was comforting in its own way, a reminder of the natural world and its power, yet inside the house, a quiet intimacy had settled between them. The cowboy spoke first, breaking the comfortable silence. He recounted tales of other storms he had encountered on his travels, unexpected rainfalls in distant towns, nights spent seeking shelter in barns or under trees, and the small lessons learned from the unpredictable nature of life. The widow listened attentively, fascinated not only by his experiences but also by the ease with which he shared them. There was no bravado, only honesty and a gentle warmth that made her feel safe and understood. As the storm raged outside, the widow realized that it was too dangerous for him to travel back to the inn where he had planned to stay. She offered him the spare room in her house, and he hesitated only briefly before accepting. There was a tension in the air, a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and the comfort of shared understanding. She led him to the small room, making sure he was comfortable, and then returned to the living area with a quiet sense of nervous excitement. They spent the evening together, talking quietly, sharing stories of their pasts, and reflecting on the unexpected paths their lives had taken. The widow found herself revealing thoughts and feelings she had long kept hidden, regrets, unspoken hopes, and dreams that had been shelved in favor of routine. The cowboy listened without judgment, offering gentle insights and encouragement. In his presence, she felt a sense of freedom, a space where vulnerability was not only allowed but welcomed. As the night deepened, the rain outside softened into a steady patter, and the air in the house grew warm with the comfort of their companionship. The widow noticed a shift in her own awareness, an awakening of feelings she had thought dormant. The presence of the cowboy, the intimacy of shared space, and the quiet trust that had grown between them all combined to create a moment that felt charged with meaning. She realized that life could still hold surprises, that closeness and connection were not limited by age, and that desire could emerge even in the most unexpected circumstances. Eventually, the need for sleep arrived, and the widow led the cowboy to the guest bed. It was a modest room, simply furnished, but it held a quiet charm that reflected the care she had put into her home. As they prepared for bed, there was a shared awareness of the unusual situation, yet there was no discomfort or awkwardness. Both understood the trust inherent in the moment, the respect for boundaries, and the subtle acknowledgement that something significant was unfolding. They settled into the bed, keeping a respectful distance at first, yet the closeness brought an unexpected sense of comfort. The widow felt the warmth of another presence beside her, the steady rhythm of breathing, and the unspoken understanding that they were safe together. She reflected on her life, on the years she had spent alone, and on the new chapter that seemed to be opening before her. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to fully embrace the sensation of being alive in the moment, of feeling connection, companionship, and trust. Conversation continued in hushed tones, voices barely above a whisper. They spoke of simple things, memories of childhood, places they had visited, and the beauty of the natural world around them. There was laughter, too, soft and genuine, that eased any lingering tension. The widow found herself surprised at how natural it felt to be open and expressive, how easily she could share thoughts and emotions that had once seemed private or unimportant. The cowboy responded with equal honesty, sharing reflections from his own life and the lessons he had learned from travel, solitude, and human connection. As the hours passed, the widow became increasingly aware of the quiet intimacy of the night. The cowboy's presence was steady and reassuring, a gentle reminder that human connection could be both comforting and exhilarating. She realized that closeness did not always require words, that trust and understanding could be communicated through gestures, glances, and shared silence. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, with rain tapping against the window, she felt a deep sense of peace, a recognition that life could still offer profound moments even when they were least expected. At one point, the widow reached out instinctively, placing her hand near the cowboy's. He responded without hesitation, allowing their hands to meet in a gentle, unspoken affirmation of trust and closeness. It was a small gesture, yet it carried immense meaning, a bridge between two lives that had converged unexpectedly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. The simplicity of the moment was powerful, a reminder that connection often emerges in the quiet, unassuming ways of daily life. The night continued with moments of shared reflection and quiet companionship. The widow felt a mixture of emotions, curiosity, excitement, gratitude, and a gentle thrill at the intimacy of the shared experience. She recognized that life had opened a new door for her, one that allowed her to rediscover the capacity for closeness, affection, and emotional vulnerability. The cowboy's presence was a catalyst, reminding her that age and circumstance were not barriers to connection, and that even in later years, the heart could find moments of joy and renewal. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled with a sense of security and contentment. The widow realized that she had allowed herself to be present in a way she had not in years, trusting another person completely and embracing the warmth of companionship. The storm outside had passed, leaving a quiet, gentle night, and within the small house, a sense of intimacy and shared experience lingered. It was a night that would remain with her, not for dramatic events or grand gestures, but for the simple, profound awareness that connection, trust, and closeness could still exist, even when least expected. When morning arrived, the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden light across the room. The widow awoke with a sense of calm and anticipation, reflecting on the previous night and the emotions it had stirred. She felt a renewed sense of vitality, a recognition that life could still hold moments of intimacy, trust, and emotional fulfillment. The cowboy stirred beside her, smiling warmly, and she realized that their connection was deepening, not just in friendship, but in a profound, emotional bond that neither could ignore. Breakfast was shared quietly in the kitchen, with the widow preparing a simple meal of eggs, bread, and tea. Conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter, shared memories, and reflections on the past and the future. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. What mattered was the quiet presence of one another, the shared understanding, and the comfort of mutual respect. The widow felt a sense of gratitude for the cowboy's arrival in her life, and she recognized that this night had marked a turning point, a moment where her heart had reopened, where trust and closeness had become possible again. By the end of Part 4, the Apache widow had discovered a new dimension of her life. She realized that emotional intimacy, trust, and vulnerability were not limited by age or circumstance. She had allowed herself to be present in the moment, to share space and connection with another human being, and to embrace the unexpected joys that life could offer. The cowboy had become not just a companion, but a catalyst for rediscovery, showing her that even in the later stages of life, there were moments of beauty, closeness, and renewal waiting to be experienced. The days following the storm carried a quiet transformation in the Apache widow's life. Her home, once a sanctuary of routine and solitude, now felt alive with possibility. She moved through her garden with a lighter step, the sun casting warmth over the flowers she tended with newfound joy. The presence of the cowboy had brought a spark she had long thought lost, and with each passing day, that spark grew into a gentle flame of renewed vitality. Though the cowboy was not in town permanently, their bond had deepened in ways that neither could ignore. He often left in the morning to continue his travels, but he promised to return, and the widow found comfort in the knowledge that their connection was not fleeting. Each visit was eagerly anticipated, bringing with it laughter, stories, and the warmth of shared understanding. She discovered that life could still surprise her, even when it seemed that the quiet, predictable years had taken hold. The widow began to notice subtle changes in herself that extended beyond the joy of companionship. Her confidence returned in small but meaningful ways. She spoke more freely with townspeople, engaging in conversations that had once seemed tedious or unnecessary. Children laughed at her jokes, neighbors admired the fresh blooms in her garden, and the town, which had regarded her as a quiet, solitary figure, now looked on with quiet admiration. She realized that the vitality she once believed had faded was, in fact, still very much alive within her. The cowboy's influence on her life was not only emotional but also practical. He had a way of encouraging her to step beyond the boundaries she had created, to try new experiences, and to embrace opportunities that once seemed intimidating. Together, they ventured beyond her property, exploring nearby hills, streams, and trails. Each journey was a reminder of the beauty of the world beyond her home and the excitement of discovery that had been waiting for her all along. These excursions brought laughter, adventure, and a renewed appreciation for life's small wonders. Despite the joy and connection, the widow was careful to maintain her independence. She had spent decades building a life of self-sufficiency, and she knew the value of personal freedom. Yet she found that independence and companionship could coexist. The cowboy never demanded her attention or constrained her choices. Instead, he offered support, shared experiences, and the gentle presence of someone who cared deeply. This balance allowed the widow to embrace both her autonomy and the newfound richness of emotional connection. The townspeople continued to notice the transformation. They saw her laughter, her renewed curiosity, and the ease with which she now engaged with the world. Those who had once assumed her best days were behind her were now amazed at her vitality. The widow became a symbol of resilience and renewal, demonstrating that life could offer joy, adventure, and companionship at any age. Her story spread quietly through the town, inspiring others to recognize that the heart's capacity for connection and happiness does not diminish with the years. One afternoon, as the widow tended her garden, she paused to reflect on the changes within her. She realized that the presence of the cowboy had not only brought companionship, but had awakened a deeper understanding of herself. She had discovered courage, joy, and emotional openness that she had long neglected. The simple act of sharing life with another person had reminded her that even in the later stages of life, there was room for growth, discovery, and love. The cowboy returned often, each visit reinforcing the bond they shared. They continued to share stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. Sometimes, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, and simply enjoy the comfort of being in each other's presence. Other times, they would explore the surrounding countryside, marveling at the changing seasons, the wildlife, and the beauty of nature. Each shared experience strengthened their connection, leaving an indelible mark on the widow's heart and soul. In the evenings, the widow reflected on the journey she had taken, from years of solitude to the discovery of companionship and emotional intimacy. She realized that her life had been rich in its own quiet way, but it had been incomplete. The cowboy had shown her that life's richness could be renewed, that even small moments of connection could bring profound joy, and that the heart could remain open to surprise and wonder. She understood that her story was not defined by age, circumstance, or solitude, but by the choices she made to embrace life fully. One day, the widow and the cowboy sat together under a large oak tree at the edge of town. The air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the gentle hum of insects. They spoke of the past, the lessons they had learned, and the paths that had brought them together. There was a deep sense of gratitude in their words, a recognition that life's twists and turns had led them to a rare and precious connection. The widow felt a quiet contentment, knowing that she had allowed herself to be open, vulnerable, and fully present. The cowboy, too, expressed his appreciation for the widow's wisdom, resilience, and warmth. He had traveled far, seen many faces, and encountered countless experiences, yet he found in her presence a sense of belonging he had long sought. Their bond was not dependent on circumstance or location, but on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. It was a connection that transcended age, past experiences, and societal expectations, a reminder that meaningful companionship can be found when hearts are open and willing. As the days passed, the widow embraced a new rhythm in her life. She balanced her routines with moments of adventure, reflection, and companionship. She continued to tend her garden, read books, and maintain her home, but these activities were now enriched by the presence of someone who shared in her joys and experiences. She laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and found a sense of purpose in nurturing not only her surroundings, but also the connections she had allowed herself to foster. The transformation was subtle yet profound. The widow discovered that the heart's capacity for renewal was limitless, that joy could be found in both small and significant moments, and that companionship could bring depth and meaning to life at any stage. The cowboy's presence had acted as a catalyst, awakening emotions, curiosity, and courage that had long lain dormant. Together, they explored the richness of life, discovering that even in later years, the world held endless possibilities for connection, laughter, and fulfillment. In time, the widow began to reflect on the lessons she had learned. She realized that life was not defined by solitude or past experiences, but by openness, courage, and the willingness to embrace what comes. She understood that companionship was not a replacement for independence but an enhancement, a source of shared joy and mutual support. She felt grateful for the unexpected arrival of the cowboy, for the experiences they had shared, and for the renewed sense of life he had inspired within her. As the story drew toward its quiet conclusion, the Apache widow looked out over her garden, the hills in the distance bathed in golden sunlight. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that life had offered her a second chance at connection, joy, and emotional intimacy. Her home, once a symbol of solitude, had become a place of warmth, laughter, and meaningful companionship. She understood that life's richness was not determined by age, but by the openness of the heart and the willingness to embrace each moment fully. The cowboy, visiting once more before resuming his travels, shared a final walk with her through the town and the surrounding fields. They laughed, reminisced, and marveled at the beauty of the world around them. There was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition that their bond would endure, even if distance separated them. The widow felt a profound gratitude for the experiences they had shared, the lessons she had learned, and the emotional renewal she had discovered through their companionship. By the end of the story, the Apache widow had fully embraced a life renewed. She moved through her days with laughter, confidence, and a sense of adventure that had long been dormant. The cowboy's presence had reminded her that life could still offer surprises, that the heart could remain open, and that connection, trust, and joy were timeless gifts. She had learned that it was never too late to discover companionship, to embrace emotional intimacy, or to allow oneself to feel fully alive. In the quiet moments, as she tended her garden or watched the sun set over the hills, she reflected on the journey she had taken. From years of solitude and routine to the rediscovery of joy and connection, her life had been transformed. The cowboy had been the catalyst, but it was her openness, courage, and willingness to embrace the unexpected that had truly allowed for change. She smiled, knowing that she had not only regained a sense of vitality, but had also discovered the enduring power of human connection and the timeless possibility of happiness.